Ogden Lodge, number 754. Many of our past masters served multiple terms in the East. The record for the longest service as master at Ogden Lodge is our second master, whose name was Thomas Silkey, and he served 12 years in a row. And that was between 1880 and 1892. A few of you may remember that. Second place belongs to Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis has served 7 years in the East at Ogden Lodge. Brother Tim Nichols here is the most recent link in a long chain of masters that go back to 1877. Many of you here today are links in that same chain. Our first worshipful master, Truman French, opened Ogden Lodge the very first time 133 years ago. And it was a very different world then. And it's difficult to imagine what that world was like in 1877. But it occurred to me last night that we have a very good example that we can point to help you give you an idea of what the world was like in 1877. If any of you have watched the TV show Little House on the Prairie, that show was set in the 1870s. So when this lodge was founded, that's about what the world was like then. It was a world of horses and buckboards and steel plows pulled by oxen and mules and one-room schoolhouses. Ogden wasn't that much different than Walnut Grove. It had a feed mill, a lumber yard, blacksmith shop, and a mercantile. Farmers worked from sunup to sundown and plowed and reaped by hand. The most important modern technologies when this lodge was founded was the telegraph, the steam locomotive, and a repeating rifle. About the time Ogden was holding its first meeting, the newspaper at that time probably was talking about the new president-elect, Ulysses S. Grant. There have been I can't read my own printing here. And there may have been some talk about continuing problems with Indian raids in the northernmost part of the state, because Indian raids are still a problem when this lodge was founded. So you can imagine that first meeting was a little different than meetings today. The lodge was probably lit with kerosene lanterns and candles. The members didn't drive to the first meeting. They either hitched up the team, walked, or rode their horse. It would have been hard for him to drive because Henry Ford was only about 12 years old when this lodge had its first meeting. And ever since that first meeting, so many years ago, Ogden has continued with that same tradition to hold meetings month after month, year after year, decade after decade, master after master for 133 years. Imagine all the history that has unfolded since this lodge was chartered. Since 1877, we've officially been through 26 presidents. 8 of those 26 presidents in the last 133 years were Masons. The RMS Titanic was designed, built, launched, sailed, sank, and lost for 73 years before being rediscovered, all in the years since this lodge was chartered. This one will surprise you. The Chicago Cubs played in 2 World Series since this lodge. And wait till next year. Masons have changed the world since 1877. The Wright brothers, Brother Orville and Brother Wilbur invented the airplane. Teddy Roosevelt charged up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. Later, as president, he left us a great American treasure, our national parks. Henry Ford invented the automobile. General Blackjack Pershing helped win World War I. Eddie Rickenbacker, anybody know who he is? The World War I flying ace, took on the German flying circus. Charles Lindbergh proved intercontinental flight was possible in the spirit of St. Louis. I think they have a baseball team too.
Yeah.
I heard that anyway. I hear that all the time anyway. Franklin Roosevelt led us through dark and dangerous times during World War II with the help of Brother Winston Churchill. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Brother James Doolittle and his raiders sent a message directly to Japan by dropping bombs on Japan from heavy bombers launched from American aircraft carriers, something that had never been done before. And of course, General MacArthur promised, "I shall return," and he did. All that happened since this lodge opened. America has been in a lot of wars since this lodge was chartered. The Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. There were at least 14 members of this lodge that fought in World War II, and we have veterans from Korea and Vietnam as well. That tradition of service continues today with members who serve in the military. in Iraq and Afghanistan. We got anybody? Yeah, in Afghanistan as well.
In Korea, yeah.
In Korea. Anyway, let me tell you. I'll tell you a quick story about a young pilot that fought in the Pacific Theater during the very end of World War II. This Mason was a very good pilot, but there were a lot of good pilots back then, and nobody paid much attention to him. He later proved himself to be an exceptional pilot during the Korean War. He survived many dangerous sorties and flew more than one plane back to base with so much damage it was unbelievable to ground crews that he was able to make it. He had such a reputation for attracting enemy anti-aircraft fire and shrapnel, he earned the nickname Old Magnet Ass. One of his most remarkable feats was during the last 9 days of the Korean War, he shot down 3 MiG jets. And that is no small accomplishment. But he didn't become famous for any of these things. It was a flight he took more than 10 years later that made him famous. And that flight wasn't even on a plane. Anybody know who I'm talking about yet? I know you know, Val. This guy was strapped to a 225-ton Atlas rocket that reached a maximum speed of 17,545 miles an hour. Scott Carpenter put into words what the rest of America was thinking at that time. He said, "Godspeed, John Glenn." John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. Now, I tell that story for a reason. When I wrote my second book, I got to interview John Glenn over the telephone. And I worked a long time to try and get in contact with him, and had finally given up. But out of the blue, one evening my phone rang, and the man on the other end of the phone said 5 words I'll never forget as long as I live. He said, "Please hold for John Glenn." I had about 1 million questions I wanted to ask him, and I couldn't remember a single one. So John Glenn just starts telling me stories. He told me about his friend John F. Kennedy. And he told me how mad he was at John F. Kennedy because he blocked him from being a Mercury astronaut because he was considered an American hero. And President Kennedy was worried what would happen if something happened to him when he was on one of his missions. And it was a major disappointment that he never forgot about. He always wanted to go back into space. He told me the pain of witnessing the assassination of Robert Kennedy. A lot of people may not know this, but he was standing right next to Robert Kennedy when he was assassinated. They were campaigning together. But I think one of the funniest things he told me is he said he's getting up there in years, and he was happy that he had now gotten so old that he had outused his usefulness to the American people and had once again become expendable, because it gave him an opportunity to finally live out a lifelong dream and return to space. And at the age of 72, he went back up into outer space in the Space Shuttle Challenger. It's just a great story. But I tell that story for a reason, because I did remember to ask him one question. I asked John Glenn if he was still active in the lodge, and he admitted that he wasn't. He said he knew a lot of Masons back when he petitioned, but by the time he retired, he didn't know very many in his lodge, and he'd gotten out of the habit. And that gets us to the third reason why we like to have these dinners. The first reason we do this is to thank our past masters for their service. The second reason is to celebrate the long history of the lodge. The final reason for having a past master dinner is that we hope some of you have had a good time today, and we'll mark the second Wednesday on your calendar and come and join us back in the lodge. We're still here. We're still having regular meetings, just like we have since Ulysses S. Grant was president. I thank you all again for coming.